All right, what's up, YouTube? So, I'm happy to say Gabby Petito's family finally filed their lawsuit and it's going to court. I have a 35-page lawsuit in front of me that I'm going to read to you guys. I'm going to put the pictures up here so that way y'all can go, read it to yourself and look at it yourself and come to your all's own conclusions. Um, okay, and also, I was just going to read certain parts of it, but I'm going to go ahead and read all of it because I know a lot of people like to know every detail of it. Like, they don't want to miss any of it. So I'm just going to go ahead and read all of it. It shouldn't take that long, but let's go ahead and get into it. So the first page says, in the 7th Judicial District Court, Grand County, State of Utah, Joseph Petito, Nicole Schmidt, individually and for on in behalf of Gabrielle Petito, deceased, versus Moab City Police Department, Brett Edge, Brandon Palmer, Eric Pratt, Daniel Robbins, and Jane/John Doe's 1 through 10. Plaintiffs Joseph Petito and Nicole Schmidt, by and through their counsel of record, Bradley H. Parker, James W. McConkey, Brian C. Stewart, Stephen Jensen, and W. Alexander Evans of the law firm of Parker and McConkey, and Troy L. Boer, J. Frederick Burroughs Jr., and Dick J. Baldwin of the law firm of Zimmerman Boer, hereby bring this action on their own behalf and on behalf of plaintiff Gabrielle Gabby Petito, deceased, against defendants Moab's Police Department, Chief Brett Edge, Assistant Chief Brandon Palmer, Officer Eric Pratt, Officer Daniel Robbins, and Jane/John Doe's 1 through 10, alleging the department's negligent hiring and failure to properly train, and the individual officers' negligence caused Gabby's tragic and untimely death. Plaintiffs allege as follows. Introduction. Number 1. The plaintiffs are the parents of Gabby Petito. Gabby was an aspiring van life travel influencer who was brutally murdered by her abusive fiance and travel companion, Brian Laundrie. I don't even like saying his name. 2. Roughly 2 weeks before Brian murdered Gabby, while the couple was visiting Moab, Utah, a witness saw Brian hit Gabby. The witness immediately called 911 to report the incident. Line 3. Gabby contacted her family to tell them that the couple had been fighting, that Brian had hit her, and that the police had been called. The family immediately responded by beginning to arrange for Gabby to fly home and to have her van shipped home to separate her from Brian. Line number 4. Moab police found the couple and investigated the reported domestic violence incident. Once the Moab Police Department stepped in, Gabby's family stepped back, believing that the situation was being appropriately handled and evaluated by competent authorities, which there's a photo that has not been released yet. And I'm guessing they're not releasing it because of this lawsuit, but in the photo, they say Gabby has a cut on her cheek and there's like blood smeared. So really, they should have took Brian to jail. I don't know anywhere else. Like, one of the people in the domestic violence case has to go to jail. Well, at least here in Tennessee, that's how it works. Line 5. The police investigation was deeply flawed. Despite the witness's report, the officers treated Brian as if he were the victim of domestic abuse rather than the perpetrator. Oh, okay. Line number 5. The police investigation was deeply flawed. Despite the witness's report, the officers treated Brian as if he were the victim of domestic abuse rather than the perpetrator. In fact, the officers never directly questioned Brian about whether he hit Gabby or how she ended up with scratches on her face. They failed to recognize or otherwise identify the obvious signs clearly indicating that Gabby was the victim of domestic abuse, including her assuming responsibility for the fight with Brian, even though she described Brian grabbing her face so violently that he scratched her cheeks and drew blood. The officers misinterpreted Gabby's extreme emotional distress, seeing it as the cause of domestic violence rather than its result. Officer Pratt, in particular, was fundamentally biased in his approach to the investigation, choosing to believe Gabby's abuser, ignoring evidence that Gabby was the victim, and intentionally looking for loopholes to get around the requirements of Utah law and his duty to protect Gabby. Line number 6. The Utah legislature has removed discretion from officers investigating domestic violence incidences. The law imposes protection against future harm, including an automatic protective order to ensure that the abuser and the victim remain separated. But here, the officers, based on their tragic failure to identify Brian as the abuser, coached Gabby to provide answers that the officers used to justify their decision not to enforce Utah law. So see, that is also a law in Utah. So they'll win this lawsuit. Watch. Okay, line number 7. This case is a vehicle for systematic change and a reckoning about how the police enforce the state's domestic abuse laws. First, police cannot continue to assert immunity under Utah law to avoid accountability for their actions that result in a wrongful death. Second, the police must be trained on and implement effective methods for evaluating domestic abuse situations so that the police can adequately protect victims according to their clear priorities mandated by the Utah legislature. Third, police departments must stop hiring and or retaining prior behavior, professional misconduct, or personal bias makes them unfit and unsafe to serve as members of the police force. Line number 8. Gabby's death constituted a wrongful death resulting from defendant's negligence, notwithstanding case law from the Utah Supreme Court holding that the state is immune in cases of wrongful death. Tide versus State 915P.2D500, Utah 1996. Plaintiffs are prepared to demonstrate that the case in question must be overturned because it relied on an incorrect assessment of the history of Utah's wrongful death actions. The Utah Constitution prohibits the legislator from abrogating the right of action for wrongful death, and at the time the Utah Constitution was drafted, that right of action included the right to assert against the state of claim for wrongful death arising from negligence. Indeed, the Utah Constitution enshrined that the common understanding that no one, including a state official, such as a police officer, enjoys immunity for negligently causing the death of another under Utah law. Line number 9. Gabby did not have to die. Gabby would still be alive if Moab Police Department had not hired, retained, and or failed to train officers who were fundamentally unfit and safe to employ in the capacity of police officer. Gabby would still be alive if the police officers had competently and properly investigated Brian's reported abuse and enforced Utah's law that were designed to remove the officer's discretion to disregard abuse. Gabby would still be alive if Officer Pratt had not intentionally coached Gabby and manipulated the investigation to try to find loopholes that would allow him to disregard the mandate of Utah law and his duty to protect Gabby. Defendant's negligence deprived Gabby of her safety and ultimately her life. Gabby's parents have been deprived of Gabby's companionship, love, and affection, and the fulfillment of the hopes that all parents cherish from their children's futures. Parties, jurisdiction, and venue. Plaintiff Gabby Petito, now deceased, was at all relevant times a resident of Northport, Sarasota County, state of Florida. Plaintiff Joseph Petito is and was at all relevant times a resident of Vero Beach, Indian River County, state of Florida, and was the natural parent of plaintiff Gabby Petito. Line number 12. Plaintiff Nicole Schmidt is and was at all relevant times a resident of Blue Point, Suffolk County, New York State, and was the natural parent of plaintiff Gabby Petito. Line number 13. Defendant Moab City Police Department is located in Moab, Grand County, state of Utah, and was at all relevant times a government entity as defined by Utah Code 63G-7-1024. Line 14. Defendant Brett Edge was at all relevant times the chief of police of the Moab City Police Department and upon information and belief currently resides in or around Moab, Grand County, state of Utah. Line number 15. Defendant Brandon Palmer was at all relevant times the assistant chief of police for the Moab City Police Department and upon information and belief currently resides in or around St. George, Washington County, state of Utah. Line number 16. Defendant Eric Pratt was at all relevant times an officer with the Moab City Police Department and upon information and belief resides in Moab, Grand County, state of Utah. On information and belief, Pratt is currently a detective with the Moab City Police Department. So he moved up. Line number 17. Defendant Daniel Robbins is and was at all relevant times an officer with the Moab City Police Department and upon information and belief resides in Moab, Grand County, state of Utah. Line number 18. Upon information and belief, defendants Jane/John Does are and were at all relevant times employees and or agents of the Moab City Police Department and reside in Moab, Grand County, state of Utah. Line number 19. Defendants' wrongful acts and omissions giving rise to this complaint occurred in or around Moab, Grand County, state of Utah. Number 20. This court has jurisdiction over this matter pursuant to Utah Code 78A-5-102, parentheses 1. Line number 21. Venue is appropriate in this court pursuant to Utah Code 78B-3-307. Number 22. Plaintiffs have complied with the requirements of Utah Code 63G-7-402. Line number 23. Plaintiffs have filed an undertaking in the amount of $300 as required by Utah Code 63G-7-601. Number 24. Plaintiffs will post a bond in an amount determined by the court as required by Utah Code 78B-3-104. Okay, factual allegations. Line number 25. Plaintiffs incorporate by this reference all previous paragraphs above as though fully set forth below. Number 26. In 2021, Gabby Petito was a 22-year-old traveling the country with her fiancé, Brian Laundrie. Page 7, line 27. Gabby Petito converted a van into a camper. Sorry, guys, I'm trying to zoom in. Line number 27. Gabby had converted a van into a camper to use in her travel as an aspiring van life travel influencer. Line 28. In the summer of 2021, Gabby and Brian traveled from New York to the western United States, visiting multiple national parks, which Gabby documented on social media, including Instagram and YouTube. Line 29. On or around August 12, 2021, Brian and Gabby were visiting Moab, Utah. Line number 30. Brian and Gabby spent much of the day in a coffee shop where Gabby worked on her social media business. 31. Brian and Gabby had been fighting much of the day, which eventually led to Brian physically and publicly assaulting Gabby outside of the Moonflower Community Cooperative. Is that a place? Anyways, line number 32. At some point, Brian grabbed Gabby by the face so forcefully that he caused multiple cuts along her cheek. After being cut by Brian, Gabby took a photo of herself and sent it to her family, which shows blood around her nose and left eye. So their family has the picture. 33. A witness observed Brian hitting Gabby and called 911 to report the incident. I'm just going to read on without telling you all the numbers. I'm just going to read on because that's making me take too long. Okay, so a witness observed Brian hitting Gabby and called 911 to report the incident. The witness reported seeing a domestic dispute, explaining that as the witness was driving past, he saw the gentleman slapping the girl. He said they ran up and down the sidewalk. He proceeded to hit her, hopped in the car, and they drove off. Another witness later reported seeing Brian hit Gabby with a closed fist, causing her to fall against the side of the van with her back and probably her head. Y'all, it makes you sick to your stomach actually reading this. It really does. Okay. Dispatch alerted officers about a man who reportedly hit a woman, then drove northbound on Main Street, away from the co-op. Officer Eric Pratt went to the co-op to investigate and got the phone number of a second witness. While at the co-op, Officer Pratt failed to activate his body camera as required and failed to locate and talk to the 911 caller who had reported Brian hitting Gabby. Using the information provided by dispatch, officers Daniel Robbins located Gabby and Brian's van speeding northward, leaving Moab, and turned his lights on to pull them over. Officer Robbins watched the van cross the double yellow line in the center of the road and swerve back to the right, hitting the curb on the side of the road. He turned on his siren and pulled over the van. Inside the van, Officer Robbins found Gabby visibly distraught, sitting in the passenger seat alongside Brian in the driver's seat. Brian was calm and showed no signs of distress. When Officer Robbins asked what was going on and why Gabby was crying, Gabby said they had been fighting over personal issues. Brian explained that it had been a long day because they There were a lot of flies where they had been camping the prior day. They changed the subject to apologize for driving into the curb. Officer Robbins asked Gabby to step out of the van, separating Gabby and Brian. Officer Robbins spoke with Gabby, who continued crying while explaining that she and Brian had been fighting and that it had been a rough morning for a few reasons. First, she told Officer Robbins that she and Brian were fighting because she was cleaning the van and had apologized to Brian about giving the impression she was in a bad mood. Second, she said they were fighting because she was working hard to start a travel blog, which had kept her busy all morning working on her computer, and that Brian did not believe she was capable of succeeding. Third, so he didn't even believe in her or nothing, so she should have left his ass a long time ago. Third, she explained they were fighting because Brian was preventing her from getting into their van because he believed she needed to calm down. While Officer Robbins spoke with Gabby, Ryan Krell, a park ranger, and Officer Pratt arrived and began speaking with Brian. Eventually, Officer Robbins finished speaking with the Gabby and had her sit in his police car while he joined Officer Pratt and Ranger Krell to speak with Brian. Brian calmly told the officers that although he and Gabby had been fighting, they had a nice morning, but that Gabby had gotten worked up while they were trying to get their van packed up to get their day going. Officer Robbins noticed scratches on Brian's face and asked him how about them. Brian explained that he had taken Gabby's phone, locked the van, and told Gabby to take a breather and calm down, at which point she tried to take her phone and the van keys from Brian. Brian admitted that he responded by pushing Gabby, and while that was happening, Gabby scratched Brian's face. Officer Pratt then spoke with Gabby. She elaborated on what she had told Officer Robbins, explaining that she was cleaning the van, and because she knows she can appear to have a mean attitude about things, how things are organized and clean, she apologized to Brian if she seemed like she was acting mean. She said, I was apologizing, but I guess I said it in a mean tone because Brian got really frustrated and locked me out of the car and told me to take a breather. But she didn't want to take a breather. They were out of water, she was thirsty, and she wanted to get going with their day. She also did not want to be locked out of her car thousands of miles from home without her cell phone. She was also in the middle of a project on her laptop, which was locked inside the car. Officer Pratt responded by observing that Brian's reaction did not calm the situation but made Gabby more upset. He then asked Gabby about the scratches on her face and on her arm, pointing out multiple scratches, and asked what had happened. Gabby initially hesitated and claimed she wasn't sure. She said she was trying to get back into the van and there was a backpack on the back of the van that scratched her. And most people in domestic violence cases, they take the blame. Like, they don't like to blame their other half. Okay, Officer Pratt then told Gabby that a couple of witnesses had reported seeing Brian punch Gabby. Gabby responded by saying that she had slapped Brian first because he kept telling me to shut up, and that Brian then grabbed her arm so she wouldn't be able to slap him again. Officer Pratt asked again if Brian had hit Gabby, and she responded, I guess, but I hit him first. She showed the officer how Brian had grabbed her face, explaining that he must have cut her cheek with his nails because she could feel the cut burning when she touched her face. Officer Pratt failed to ask any questions about or document the cut on Gabby's face or further investigate Brian violently grabbing Gabby's head and face. Officer Pratt did not ask about whether Brian had ever locked Gabby out of the van before, or taken away her cell phone or her laptop, or otherwise acted in a way to exercise control over Gabby. Officer Pratt also did not ask about whether Brian had ever been violent with Gabby before. Officer Pratt did not consider the seriousness of the force Gabby used on Brian as compared with the force Brian used on Gabby, nor did he otherwise conduct any kind of assessment to evaluate whether Brian violently grabbing Gabby's face was an indicator of potential escalating violence in the future. Rather than probing Brian and Gabby's vague story about how their fight led to physical violence, including asking for additional details about the facts Gabby had already explained, Officer Pratt appeared to simply accept Gabby's claim that she hit Brian first, as if the violence reported by witnesses was an isolated incident without any provocation. Instead, Officer Pratt steered the conversation by patronizingly questioning Gabby about whether she was okay, asking if she took medication for anxiety, and asking leading questions about Brian being pretty patient with Gabby. Gabby responded by saying that Brian gets really frustrated with her and also has a lot of anxiety. Officer Pratt then shared some observations from his personal life, specifically, he talked about how he and his ex-wife also had anxiety and that they would feed off each other and spiral. In other words, rather than investigating the factors that led to the violence between Brian and Gabby to determine whether Gabby was a victim of domestic abuse, including Brian reportedly responding to Gabby's apology by taking her phone, locking her out of their car and away from her laptop, and telling her to take a walk, as well as Brian grabbing Gabby's face with so much force that he sliced her cheek open with his fingernails. Officer Pratt compared the situation to his prior relationship and attributed the confrontation to a bad combination of two people with anxiety. Officer Pratt then left Gabby and went to speak with Brian. Officer Pratt began joking with Brian about both of them being bald and asking if Brian would like to move into the shade to talk because Officer Pratt felt bad for him. Officer Pratt told Brian that when they arrived on the scene, they were worried about what kind of guy Brian was from what they had heard, but in talking to Gabby, it sounds to me like maybe this is not so clear cut. In other words, without investigating the underlying conduct that led to Brian and Gabby's fight, Officer Pratt had decided that Brian's violence was excusable because of Gabby's anxiety. Brian then gave his version of events to Officer Robbins. He explained that a lot of little things had contributed to the tension between Brian and Gabby that led to violence. For example, he talked about how Gabby had grown irritated about the flies at their prior campsite, Brian's dirty feet, and Brian's decision to move some items around in the van. He confirmed Gabby's story that their fight escalated once Brian told Gabby to take a breather and he locked the van, but claimed he only shoved Gabby as a defensive measure.